That evening I learned that some men wear their cruelty like a Sunday suit, pressed, polished, and completely on purpose. My name is Nadine Holloway. I'm 62 years old, retired schoolteacher, grandmother of 2, and the kind of woman who brings casseroles to neighbors and remembers every birthday in the family. I am not dramatic. I am not a troublemaker. I have never in my life stood up in front of a crowd and said something that couldn't be unsaid. Until the night of my son's rehearsal dinner. But before I tell you what I did, I need to tell you how I got there. Because what happened that Friday evening in the banquet room of the Harrington House restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, didn't start that night. It started 8 months earlier, on a Sunday afternoon in my kitchen, when my son Calvin told me he'd met someone. Calvin was 34. He worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm downtown, honest work, steady pay, the kind of job where you show up on time and you leave knowing you did something real. He wasn't flashy. He drove a used Civic, lived in a clean one-bedroom apartment, and called me every Sunday without fail. He was the kind of man I had raised him to be, and I was proud of that every single day. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and that look on his face, the one I hadn't seen since he was 16, and trying to tell me he'd wrecked his bicycle. Nervous, fidgeting with the handle of his mug. "Mom," he said, "I've been seeing someone." Seriously seeing someone. I put down my dish towel. How serious? "Her name is Lydia." He smiled when he said it. Not a polite smile, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in years. He told me about her over the next hour. She was 31, a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center on the north side of town. She'd grown up in Gahanna, just outside Columbus. She was close with her mother, less close with her father, which Calvin mentioned almost as an aside, the way you mention weather. Her father, he told me, was Reginald Ashworth, owner of Ashworth Premier Properties, commercial real estate, strip malls, office parks, the kind of business that made serious money and made sure everyone knew it. "Have you met him yet?" I asked. Calvin's expression shifted just slightly. "Once, at their house for dinner. And—" he looked out the window. "He's a lot." I stored that away. A lot. 2 words, and already I felt something tighten at the base of my stomach. 3 weeks later, I met Lydia. She came to Sunday dinner with Calvin, helped me carry things to the table without being asked, and spent the whole evening asking me questions about teaching. Real questions. Curious ones. Not the kind people ask when they're just being polite. She had her mother's gentleness, Calvin told me later. Her father's drive, but her mother's heart. Her mother, Constance, was a quiet woman I would meet a few months later at a joint family dinner. She had silver hair, careful posture, and the practiced smile of someone who had learned a long time ago to take up less space in a room. I recognized it immediately. I had a cousin who wore that same smile for 20 years before she finally left her husband. Reginald Ashworth arrived at that first family dinner 20 minutes late and did not apologize for it. He was a broad man, somewhere in his mid-60s, with thick silver hair and the kind of handshake that's meant to establish something. He ordered for Constance without asking her. He interrupted Calvin twice while Calvin was describing a project he was working on. And when he found out Calvin rented his apartment rather than owned it, he set his fork down with a quiet, deliberate clink and said, "Renting at 34. Just that. I smiled at him across the table and said nothing, but I watched everything. Calvin proposed to Lydia in March at a small restaurant where they'd had their first real date. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He called me from the parking lot, voice cracking, and I sat on my back porch in the cold and cried, the good kind of tears. But that same night, I lay awake thinking about Reginald Ashworth and his deliberate fork and his and I thought, that man is going to try to ruin this. I didn't know how yet. I just knew I was right. 2 weeks after the engagement, Lydia called me upset. Her father had told Calvin privately that he thought the engagement was a mistake, that Lydia had always been too sentimental for her own good, that a man who rented his apartment and drove a used car had no business taking on a woman who was accustomed to a certain quality of life. "He said that?" I asked. "He says things like that," Lydia said quietly. There was something resigned in her voice, the sound of someone repeating an old hurt with new words. "What did Calvin say?" Calvin was very calm. He said he understood Mr. Ashworth's concerns and that he intended to build a good life for me. She paused. My dad laughed. I thanked her for telling me, hung up the phone, and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The wedding planning began in April. Reginald announced immediately that he would be paying for the rehearsal dinner and had already spoken to the manager at the Harrington House, a place he frequented and had a standing relationship with. He also announced, through Lydia, that he expected the guest list to be appropriate. When pressed on what that meant, he said he didn't want the event to feel like a backyard cookout. Calvin told me about it at Sunday dinner, trying to keep his voice neutral. I could see the effort it was taking. "He said what he said," Calvin told me. "I'm not going to let it get to me." But I saw his shoulders. I saw how he held his jaw. I knew my son. And I decided to do something I had never done before in my 62 years of living. I called an investigator. His name came to me through my friend Dolores, who'd gone through a difficult divorce 4 years prior. His name was Paul Kemper, retired cop, now private investigator, based out of a small office in Worthington. I met him on a Wednesday afternoon. His office smelled like old coffee and printer paper. He had a measured way of speaking, the kind of man who chose his words carefully and meant everyone. I told him everything. About Reginald Ashworth, about his business, about the dinner, about the things he'd said to Calvin. I told him I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, only that something about that man felt like a house with a crack in the foundation, fine from the street, dangerous up close. Paul said he understood. He told me he'd need 2 weeks. What he found took my breath away. Reginald Ashworth had been having an affair for 11 years. The woman's name was Sylvine Marceau. I'm choosing not to use her real name out of respect for her, because what I later learned was that she had been deceived as thoroughly as anyone. She was 44, an office manager at one of Ashworth's properties in Dublin, Ohio. She believed Reginald was in the process of divorcing Constance. He had been telling her this for 11 years. They had a daughter together. She was 9 years old and had her father's eyes, according to the photographs Paul showed me. Reginald paid the rent on Sylvine's townhouse, had set up a small private account to cover the child's expenses, and visited 2 or 3 times a week on evenings when he told Constance he was meeting with investors. But that wasn't the worst of it. Paul had also pulled public records on Ashworth Premier Properties and found something that made me go very still at that desk in his office in Worthington. 3 years earlier, Reginald had entered into a federally backed affordable housing development contract, a community revitalization initiative in a lower-income neighborhood on Columbus's east side. $18 million in government funding. He was contracted to build 85 units of affordable housing. He had built 31. The remaining money had been moved through a series of internal transfers, some to a separate LLC he owned, some to personal accounts, some simply unaccounted for. There were currently 2 civil suits filed against Ashworth Premier Properties by a community advocacy organization and a group of displaced families who had paid application deposits on units that were never completed. There was also, Paul told me quietly, an ongoing investigation by the Ohio Attorney General's office. He didn't know the timeline. He didn't know how close they were. I sat in that chair and looked at the documents spread across Paul's desk. Bank statements, transfer records, construction permits that had been filed and abandoned, photographs of the half-built complex sitting behind a chain-link fence on Livingston Avenue. I thought about the families on that street. I thought about people who had saved and waited and filled out paperwork and believed that someone was building them a home. I thought about Calvin, my honest, hard-working son who rented his apartment because he refused to carry debt he couldn't responsibly manage, being called inadequate by the man sitting on stolen money. I paid Paul, took the copies he'd made for me, drove home, and put the folder in the bottom of my linen closet under a stack of guest towels I never used. And I waited. The weeks before the rehearsal dinner were ordinary on the surface. I finished alterations on the dress I was wearing. I brought Lydia lunch at her clinic one afternoon, and we sat in the parking lot eating sandwiches and talking about flowers. She was so happy. She glowed with it, the way young women in love do, and I sat there watching her and carrying my folder of secrets like a stone in my chest. I almost told her. 3 times I came close. But Lydia had spent 31 years building a version of her father that she could live with. A flawed version, yes. She knew he was difficult, controlling, dismissive. But a version she had found a way to love anyway. I wasn't sure I had the right to take that from her on a normal Tuesday. So I waited for Reginald to make a move. He didn't disappoint. The Friday evening of the rehearsal dinner, Harrington House was exactly what Reginald Ashworth would choose. Dark wood paneling, white tablecloths, a private dining room with a long table set for 40 guests. He had provided the wine. He had approved the menu. He had arranged the seating without consulting Calvin or me. I was seated at the far end of the table, between Dolores, who'd come as my guest, and Calvin's college roommate, Bernard. Reginald sat at the head, with Constance to his left and an empty seat to his right that I later learned he'd reserved for a business associate who didn't end up coming. Calvin looked handsome and nervous. Lydia looked radiant. They sat together in the middle of the table, their hands finding each other under the white cloth every few minutes. Dinner was served. Salmon, roasted vegetables, an expensive Chardonnay I didn't drink. The conversation was pleasant on the surface, the kind of pleasant that takes effort to maintain. And then the toasts began. Reginald stood up. He tapped his glass. The room quieted. He began with Lydia. Of course he did. He talked about her childhood, her accomplishments, her years of work, building her career. He talked about how proud he was, and some of it, I believe, was genuine. Whatever else he was, he loved his daughter in his way. Then he turned to Calvin. "Now, Calvin," he said, and his voice shifted into something that I can only describe as fondly condescending. The tone of a man who has decided to be gracious about lowering his standards. "Calvin is a hard-working young man. I'll give him that. He's earnest. He's dependable. Lydia tells me he's never once been late to anything." Polite laughter around the table. "Not the most ambitious fellow I've ever met, but Lydia has always had a soft spot for." He paused and smiled, and the pause was the whole thing. Fixer-uppers. The laughter that followed was uncomfortable. Some people chuckled because they didn't know what else to do. Some people looked at their plates. Bernard, next to me, muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch. I looked at Calvin. He was smiling, a locked, controlled, closed smile. His hand was flat on the table. Lydia's face had gone very still. Reginald raised his glass. "To Lydia and Calvin, may she be patient, and may he surprise us all." People raised their glasses. Some drank. I set mine down. I had not planned to do what I did next. I want to be honest about that. I had told myself I would only act if Reginald said something truly unforgivable. I had drawn that line in my own mind, and sitting at that table, watching my son hold his smile like a shield, I understood that the line had just been crossed. I stood up. "I'd like to say a few words, if that's all right." Reginald looked at me from the head of the table with the expression of a man who has never once been interrupted and intends to make that clear. "Of course," he said slowly. "Mrs. Holloway." I walked to the front of the room. I didn't hurry. I stood where Reginald had stood, and I looked at the table full of people. Calvin's colleagues, Lydia's friends, family from both sides, a few of Reginald's business acquaintances in their expensive jackets. "My son Calvin," I said, "is not a fixer-upper. He is a man of integrity. He has never lied to a client, never cut a corner on a project, never made a promise he didn't keep. In 34 years, I have never once had reason to be ashamed of him." I paused. I cannot say the same about everyone in this room. The silence was immediate and total. I reached into my handbag and took out a manila envelope. I had brought only one, not the full folder, just enough. Selected pages, the kind of thing that once seen cannot be unseen. "Several months ago," I said, "I became concerned about the kind of family my son was marrying into, not Lydia. Lydia is a remarkable woman, and I love her already. I mean the business practices and personal conduct of her father." Reginald was on his feet. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" "I'm telling the truth," I said. "You can sit back down." He didn't sit. I addressed the table. Ashworth Premier Properties received $18 million in federal funding 3 years ago to build 85 units of affordable housing on Livingston Avenue in Columbus. 31 units were built. The rest of the money— I set the first page on the table nearest me and slid it toward the center— was moved through a series of internal transfers. Some of it funded a separate LLC. Some of it funded personal expenses. Some of those families are still waiting. The room erupted, multiple voices. Someone said, "What?" loudly enough to carry. 2 of Reginald's business associates leaned forward and looked at each other. Reginald moved toward me. "Those are fabrications. You have no idea what you're—" "There are also," I continued, my voice steady, "civil suits filed by a community advocacy organization and by families who paid deposits, and an ongoing investigation by the Ohio Attorney General." I set the second page down. "Mr. Ashworth, you called my son a fixer-upper. In front of his fiancée, in front of his family, in front of his friends. You have been calling him inadequate since the day Lydia told you she loved him. And you did it because you believed that money made you better than him." I looked at him directly. "My son has never stolen $18 million from working families, has never looked a woman in the eye for 11 years and told her a marriage was ending when it wasn't, has never used the earnings of other people's labor to fund a life built entirely on other people's trust." The room went absolutely silent. Constance had turned white. She was looking at me, then at Reginald, her eyes asking the question her mouth wouldn't. Lydia had both hands pressed to her mouth. Calvin was staring at me. I could not read his face. "You are welcome," I said quietly, "to dispute any of this. The documents are sourced, the public records are public, and the people on Livingston Avenue are real." I placed the envelope on the table and walked back to my seat. What followed was not a dinner party anymore. It was a room full of people trying to figure out what had just happened and what they were supposed to do about it. Reginald attempted twice to regain control, once by demanding I be removed, once by calling the documents falsified. but two of his own business associates had picked up the pages and were reading them, and the silence that followed his protest was more damning than any argument I could have made. Constance left the table. I saw her go to the coat check. Lydia followed her. Reginald left shortly after that, without a word to Calvin. I stayed. I finished my water. Bernard offered me some of his wine, and I accepted. Calvin came to me after the room had mostly emptied. He sat down across from me at the long white table with the wilting centerpieces and the half-eaten plates and the abandoned glasses. "Mom," he said. "I know. You knew all of this. It wasn't a question. For several months. He was quiet for a long time. Why didn't you tell me? I wasn't sure you'd want to know, and I wasn't sure Lydia was ready to know. I told myself I would wait and see whether he would be decent." I looked at my son. He wasn't decent. Calvin pressed his hands flat on the table. "You could have ruined everything." "I know." "What if Lydia? What if she?" "I know, Calvin." He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the parking lot for what felt like a long time. When he turned back, his eyes were red. "She's with her mom right now," he said. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know if there's still going to be a wedding." "I know." "You don't seem scared." "I'm terrified," I told him honestly. "But I couldn't sit there and let him do that to you again. I tried. I sat at that table all through dinner, and I tried. And then he made that toast, and I couldn't." Calvin looked at me for a long moment, then he left. I drove home alone and sat in my kitchen with the lights off and my coat still on. Lydia called me 3 days later. Her voice was quiet, worn, but steady. The voice of someone who has been crying and has run out of tears and is now just managing. She told me she had spoken to her mother, that Constance, when confronted, had admitted she had suspected the affair for years, but had never been able to confirm it. She had told herself it wasn't real. She had told herself a lot of things for a long time. Lydia told me she didn't know how to feel about what I'd done. "I don't blame you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, but I need some time." I told her I understood completely. I told her to take all the time she needed. I told her the truth, that I had acted to protect Calvin, but that I had thought about her too, and that I was sorry for the way it landed on her without warning. "Did you know?" she asked me. "About the woman? About the little girl?" "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "I have a sister," she said finally, "that I didn't know about." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "She's 9 years old," Lydia said. "Her name is Bet." Calvin didn't call me for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Sunday afternoons where my phone stayed quiet and I sat with my coffee and made myself be still. I had made my choice. I had to be willing to live with the consequences. He came on a Tuesday evening in November, knocked on my door rather than using his key, which told me everything about where we were. I let him in. I put coffee on. We sat at the kitchen table. "The wedding is still happening," he said. I exhaled slowly. "How is Lydia?" He stopped. "She's not okay, but she's going. She said that what you did was the bravest and most terrifying thing she's ever seen anyone do, and that she needed time to understand which one it was more." "And which did she decide?" Calvin looked at me. "Brave. She decided brave." He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Mom, I want you to understand something. I was angry. There are parts of this I am still working through. You made a decision that was mine to make." "I know. But—" He stopped, set his mug down. "I also know what that room looked like when you stood up. I know what it felt like to sit in that chair and listen to him talk about me like I was a charity case. I've been listening to versions of that for a year. He looked up at me. Nobody in my whole life has ever stood up for me like that. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. I will always stand up for you, even when it's wrong. He laughed, just a short, startled laugh. That's not exactly reassuring. I know. We sat there for a while, just the two of us, the coffee, the quiet kitchen. Reginald Ashworth was indicted by the Ohio Attorney General 4 months after the rehearsal dinner. The charges were misappropriation of public funds, wire fraud, and breach of contract. The civil suits were consolidated into a larger action. He surrendered his real estate license and agreed to a plea deal that included restitution and 5 years in federal prison. I read about it in the Columbus Dispatch on a Wednesday morning while I was eating toast. Constance filed for divorce the same month. She moved into a smaller house in Westerville, close to her sister. Lydia told me she seemed, for the first time in years, like someone who was sleeping well. The wedding happened on a clear Saturday in April at a small chapel near Bexley that Calvin and Lydia had chosen entirely on their own. 53 people. Lydia wore her grandmother's earrings. Calvin cried during the vows, which surprised him and no one else. There was no toast from the father of the bride. I gave a toast instead. Short. I said that marriage was not a performance and not a competition. I said that the only foundation worth building on was the truth, even when the truth was hard to say and harder to hear. I said I loved them both and wished them a life that was genuinely happy rather than impressively happy. People clapped. A few of them cried. Calvin caught my eye from across the room and nodded once, slowly. That was enough. Sylphine Marceau, I learned later through Lydia, had ended her relationship with Reginald immediately after the rehearsal dinner, not because of the news coverage, but because Lydia had reached out to her directly, woman to woman, and told her the truth. Sylphine had believed for 11 years that she was waiting for a man who was transitioning out of a marriage. She was not angry at Lydia. She was grateful for the honesty and devastated by the years she had lost. She and Lydia have spoken several times since then. Bet, Lydia's half-sister, came to their home for Thanksgiving the following year. She was 10 by then, a serious, bright-eyed little girl who ate 3 helpings of stuffing and fell asleep on the couch before dessert. Calvin covered her with the blanket from the back of the sofa without making a production of it. I watched him do it and thought, that is exactly the man I raised. I think about that rehearsal dinner often. I think about whether I would do it differently. I have asked myself whether I told the truth to protect my son or to punish Reginald Ashworth, and I will be honest with you. I don't think the answer is as clean as I would like it to be. I was angry. I had been angry for months, and there was something in me that night, watching him stand at that head table with his wine glass and his smug, deliberate cruelty, that decided the time for being careful was finished. But I also know what those documents said. I know what was sitting on Livingston Avenue behind a chain-link fence. I know how many families filled out those applications. And I know that a man who steals from people who have nothing and calls the honest ones inadequate does not deserve to be protected by anyone's silence, least of all mine. There is a family on Livingston Avenue. I know this because one of the women from the advocacy organization wrote to me after the indictment. She said her name was Cynthia. She said she had paid her deposit 2 years before and had been fighting ever since. She said when the story broke, she cried for an hour, not because the money came back right away. It hadn't, not yet. But because someone had finally said out loud what she already knew. She said she was going to keep fighting. I wrote her back. I told her I was glad she was. I told her that the truth is heavy to carry alone. And I hoped it felt a little lighter now. Calvin and Lydia's daughter was born the following January. They named her May. She has Lydia's nose and Calvin's stubborn chin and the loudest set of lungs I have encountered in 62 years on this earth, which I consider a very good sign. The first time I held her, standing in the hospital room with the afternoon light coming through the window, I thought about everything that had led to that moment. Every dinner I had smiled through, everything I had chosen not to say, the folder in my linen closet, the drive to Worthington, the white tablecloth and the wilting centerpiece in the moment I stood up. And I thought, yes, it was worth it, every bit of it. I keep coming back to that moment right before I stood up. The way Calvin's hands were flat on the table, the way his smile had gone completely still, like a door someone had closed from the inside. I had watched my son absorb humiliation for a year, quietly, patiently, the way he did everything, and something in me that night simply decided it was finished. I won't pretend it was a clean decision. I've thought about it enough now, to be honest. Part of what moved me out of that chair was anger. Real, deep, months-old anger. And I think that's worth saying, because the stories we tell about doing the right thing tend to smooth out the parts where the right thing and the furious thing were the same thing at the same time. But here's what I've also come to understand. Reginald Ashworth did not end up alone in a federal courtroom because I stood up at a dinner table. He ended up there because of every choice he made across decades. He chose to take money meant for families who had nothing. He chose to lie to his wife, to Sylvine, to everyone who trusted him. He chose to walk into that room and humiliate my son for sport. Those were his choices, and what followed was simply the weight of them catching up. I was just the person who happened to be standing there when they arrived. Calvin asked me once, a few months after everything settled, whether I thought I'd done the right thing. I told him what I told you, that I wasn't sure my motivations were as pure as I'd like them to be. He said that didn't matter to him. He said what mattered was that I knew the difference between what was true and what was comfortable, and I chose the true thing even when it cost me. That's what I think about now when I look at May. She's 2 years old. She doesn't know any of this yet. Someday she will, in whatever version Calvin and Lydia decide to tell her. And I hope what she takes from it isn't the drama of that dinner or the headlines about her grandfather's indictment. I hope she takes something quieter than that. I hope she learns that being a good person isn't the same as being an easy person. That real integrity means knowing what you know and not pretending otherwise, not to protect yourself, not to keep the peace, not because it's more comfortable. I raised Calvin to be honest in his work, careful with his commitments, and unwilling to cut corners even when cutting corners would have been faster. That's not nothing. That kind of steadiness is something you build over years, and it holds when everything else shakes. Reginald had power and money and the appearance of success, and he burned all of it because none of it was built on anything real. Calvin had a used Civic and a rented apartment and a mother who believed in him, and he has a daughter named May and a wife who knew from the beginning exactly who she was choosing. I think about that a lot. The truth is a hard thing to carry and a harder thing to say out loud. But it is the only thing in my experience that actually holds. Everything else, the image, the money, the carefully constructed version of yourself that you present at dinner parties, all of it has a shelf life. The truth doesn't. It just waits. And eventually it arrives.